The stone steps of Baelor's September were hot even in the fall, as if the day had banked coals beneath every flag. Eddard Stark stood with his hands bound and his head bare to a sun that felt southern and wrong. His hair lank with sweat and his knee a knot of ache. The crowd pressed airlessly against the square. 1,000 throats, 1,000 mouths, 1,000 eyes that would carry what they saw into 10,000 kitchens and camps. The bells were still heavy as judgment. He found Sansa first. She was a pale flicker by the dais, her hair like a brand in the light, her hands clenched white at the rail. Every time he looked at her, he saw smaller hands gripping a snow-packed hilt. A girl learning to brave an empty yard in a winter that was no winter by the wall's measure. He could not make himself search for Arya in the chaos, for to fail to find her would swallow what was left of his stomach. He had smelled the black cells on his own skin this morning. Damp rot and salt, stone that tasted of iron. He had heard Varys's soft voice in the dark and thought him a betrayer and a savior both. He had chosen already, long before the sun pulled him here. Joffrey was all gilding and angles and a boy's thin arrogance, enthroned above them in a chair that looked too hungry to hold a child. Cersei stood at his shoulder, cold as a drawn knife. The High Septon's lips moved, and Ned heard words about mercy and truth and loyalty that dissolved like breath. Around them, the Lannister crimson ran like spilled paint along ranks of gold cloaks. Island Payne's sword leaned by his knee, the great gray thing that had once been ice and was now a stranger. "Lord Eddard Stark," Joffrey said, his voice pitched to reach the far edges of the square. "You have been judged treasonous against your king. Speak the truth and the gods may show you mercy." Truth. Varys had said other things in the night, about daughters and pity, about the frailty of the realm in the hands of boys and wolves. He had spoken of a way to save Sansa and Arya, a way to live. He had counseled confession, lie and die another day. But when Eddard Stark closed his eyes on this bright, punishing noon, he saw the words he had built his children on. The taste of hot bread in a cold hall, the breath of winter beyond an open door. He saw a wall of old snow under a sky so black with stars that the world seemed like a dropped velvet cloak. Honor would not save a man from a sword, but it could keep him from bowing to a lie. He stepped forward and the heat ran down his spine. A hiss went through the crowd as if a single body had drawn breath. "I will not name truth a lie," he said, and his voice was hoarse but it carried. "I will not call treason what was duty. My king was Robert Baratheon. He commanded me to guard the realm. I did as I was sworn." A pair of birds flurried under the dome and vanished. Cersei's mouth thin as a wound, Littlefinger's eyes like coins. Sansa took one step, stopped as if the invisible hand of a court had closed on the hem of her gown. Ned lifted his head. "But I am a condemned man by your word. Let that be. By the old practice and in sight of the seven, I ask leave to take the black. I will go to the wall and serve the realm until my death." Noise came like surf. The old words had weight, the right of condemned men to choose a life of the watch instead of a short road and a headsman. Thieves had spoken them, poachers and brawlers and peasants who had struck their lords. They had not often been spoken by a great lord of the north, but the wall did not inquire after birth once the words were said. The watch asked only for nights and days and breath, until the marrow itself went cold. Joffrey opened his mouth. Cersei's hand touched his sleeve, light as frost. The High Septon blinked. He was old enough to remember times when such words were not novelty. Varys looked at the boy king with an expression so simple it must have been crafted as carefully as a golden brooch. Admiration, pleading, a soft noise of courtly awe. "Let it show my mercy," Joffrey said after a heartbeat too long. He made it grand because that was the only way he knew to make anything. His chin came up. "Let it be known that I spare Eddard Stark the sword. He will take the black and trouble me no more." He pronounced it with all the weight of a child saying he would not eat turnips, and the square exhaled as if it had been held shut inside a fist. Island Payne did not move toward ice. The gold cloaks did not seize Ned's hair. Sansa collapsed into tears she had been holding in since the doors opened, her hand over her mouth. Cersei smiled with the neat satisfaction of a bored player who sacrifices a piece she hates anyway to win a better game. Littlefinger's shoulders sank by a hair, the only sign that something had not gone to his liking. Ned's knees nearly gave. He bowed, not to the boy but to the decree that would open the gate north. The heat eased, though the sun had not moved. He tried to find Arya once more and failed. The bells remained silent, as if they too were held to a vow. That night Varys visited one last time, robed like a midnight moth. The torch he carried hissed and spat as he opened the iron door. "I did not expect you to say those words," the eunuch murmured, voice low. "Bold." The queen was not pleased, but she does not relish a martyr. "The wall is useful yet." "I did not lie," Ned said. He would not call it courage. He had simply held to himself like a man clinging to rock in a river. "No," Varys said, "you did not." He watched Ned with a stillness that hinted at lanes of thought winding past the torchlight. "You leave before dawn. Yoren of the Night's Watch will meet you beyond the Gate of the Gods. He will have other recruits whose lives weigh less in sum than your name. Travel will be faster in their shade." "My daughter." "The elder remains in the court's keeping," Varys said. "The younger is not in their hands. Not yet." "Elo," okayed like a man at a harp as he added, "I will try to keep the elder whole. As for the younger, I will risk one more word. Yoren knows how to hide live coals in damp ash. Do not expect letters. Do not expect anything but the wall." "Then let me have my rags," Ned said. "The watch will strip everything else away." Varys inclined his head. "The realm thanks you, Lord Stark." "Do not call me Lord," Ned said. "Not after dawn." They walked him under night's crusted pan of stars through a city that slept badly in its silk. The gold cloaks had left him his name and his legs and placed an iron chain upon his wrists, and the links clinked when he shifted his hands like a small bell. Beyond the Gate of the Gods a wagon waited under a tarp and a lean, hard man with hair gone to iron gray. Yoren had a face like a fence post that had seen too many winters. "Get in," the Black Brother said. "We ride now. I don't fancy cocksure boys at my elbow after a dawn." He eyed the chain, sniffed. "You'll have it off once the city's behind us." The watch don't like men wearing their shame past need. They jolted away into the dark with wheels that creaked a complaint at each rut. Ned had the tarp smell in his nose and the rhythm of horses under him, and the slow unraveling of the city became the open country's breath. Dawn found them already far along the King's Road, the sun emerging like a grudging thought over the eastern hills. Yoren's recruits rode or walked in twos and threes, some in manacles, some free for lack of spirit. Boys who kept their chins like blades for fear they'd spill tears. Old men whose eyes had gone to watered glass. A lad with thick arms and flour still under his nails. Another with a nose broken so often it had lost the habit of straightness. A soft-cheeked youth with a smith's balance in his walk, traveling under a hood as if he meant not to be seen. They stared at Ned with the prickle of curiosity men reserve for a thing they know and can't place. He was a story to them. He tried to be a man instead, with his chain and his salt-gray beard and a silence that ached. Yoren cut the chain at a farm lane with a grin that looked like it had been stolen from another man. A man who grinned often. "You'll carry it in your bones," he said, gathering the links. "That's punishment enough. Keep your head low. You'll draw flies otherwise, and flies bring men who fancy wine and wages for bringing you back." Ned rubbed his wrists. The iron had left its memory in his skin, half-moons of bruised flesh. "Do they know we left?" "They know we left," Yoren said. "Whether they know who left, that's a meat of another stew. I got a writ says I can bring any who'll join and any who choose the black." And a nod from a man who smells like secrets that said I should move quick. "Secrets or not, I know the road. Keep your hood up." They made miles. The King's Road unfurled as if a giant had thrown down a length of gray silk, villages brushing its edges like burrs. Ned kept his thoughts tight to his ribs. Sansa was a tether to King's Landing, and if he thought on that stretch of rope too intently he felt it cut. Arya was either a shadow near him or a bird already north. He refused to drag her into his mind, as if thought alone could slow her feet. When the riders came behind them, Yoren saw them first, a lift of his chin, his eyes off to the left where the trees thickened. "Gold cloaks," he grunted. "2, maybe 3, and rented horses, which means they'll ride them past good sense." His gaze ran the train like fingers over beads. "Keep walking," he told them all. "Keep walking. Keep your mouths closed. You," he jabbed a finger at the hooded smith boy. "Don't show me your face. Flower lad. Stop gawping like you're a hog seeing a fire for the first time." He turned to Ned. "You're a hawk with your hood on. Remember that." Ned lowered his head and watched the shadow of his hood move on the packed earth. The riders clattered closer, voices high with authority and nervousness. Yoren slid his bone-handled knife back into his sleeve as they slowed. "What's your business?" the sergeant demanded. "My business is the wall," Yoren said. "Yours is getting off this horse eventually and wishing you'd been born a girl in Dorne. We're hunting a man." The sergeant scanned their faces, more bravado than breath behind his eyes. "A black-haired boy, a smith's apprentice." "We got black-haired boys," Yoren said. "We're breeding 'em for winter. We got boys with hair like ravens, boys with hair like burnt straw, boys who think they're wolves. The watch takes all sorts, even the sort that asks stupid questions." He spit. "You want to go through my recruits and slow the wall's will? That's asking for a ghost at your shoulder. Tell it to the Lord Commander when he comes south to shave you for a cloak. Else turn your horses west and chase your own tails." Something in his voice made the sergeant shift. He peered. He did not dismount. He looked at the boy with the hood and looked away sooner than he should have. Ned felt the moment pass like weather. The riders were gone in a churn of dust, all clatter and show on the road's long throat. Yoren lifted a shoulder as if to shrug off an entire capital. "Longer we talk to men who want to guess at names, longer we test the gods." They carried on with the road's unanswerable patience. At night they lay under hedges and in haylofts and in the lee of old watchtowers whose baked bricks still held summer's heat. Yoren snored like a man sawing a ship's keel. Ned, who had known the easy sleep of a winter lord in a cold castle, found watchfulness bred by the black cells slow to drain. When he dreamed of winter, not as a word on a banner but as a thing with teeth. He dreamed of the wall as a line drawn in light on dark. Far behind them, a girl in a boy's cropped hair dodged through boulevards under the weight of a city at war with itself. Yoren had found her in a press of bodies at A.S. Quare now whispering about mercy, his big hand closing on her arm before her mouth could open and her father's name could become a blade. He cut her hair with a dagger and told her he'd known girls who'd killed men, and that she'd be a boy until the wall, and that if she opened her mouth a bird would fly screaming from it with her name on its wings. She watched the ossuary of a city's outskirts from a farmer's cart and bit the sides of her mouth, so she could not taste father on the air. The word north, unspooled like a string, she wrapped around her finger until it cut. She looked at a lanky youth with a smith's grip and saw a sword she'd lose and find again in a world that trafficked in losses. When gold cloaks demanded a boy, the smith stood as if he had grown in that very spot. Yoren sounded like the wall itself. She pressed herself into shadows and willed her breath to have no sound. When at last the riders left, she let out air and wished it were a blade that would go back and cut a boy king's throat. "Airy," Yoren said later, as they made a fire that made only a whisper of flame. "You keep eyes forward. You think only on your feet. When you get to the wall, you'll get another name if you want and get rid of the one you got. Name's way too much south of there." "I don't want any name," she muttered, but the sound was small. "I want my father." Yoren stirred the little flame. "The wall's the only way you get him. Breathe, boy." Ned Stark crossed the neck and smelled the marshes in his bones. The old peat stink that meant he was moving toward a place where the cold had a right to speak. The hood was less necessary by then. The eyes that watched them belonged to frogs on stones and men with mud to their knees who did not care about King's Landing. Once, at a way stop, a man with a pale, fat hand gestured him to show his face, and Yoren said, without heat, that he had fire under his cloak and didn't mind lighting it. The man turned his head. Sometimes the world changed not because it was struck but because it was simply refused. News drifted past them like leaves in water. Lord Tywin in the Riverlands, torching bread and barns. The young wolf marching. A golden host retreating over a bridge when a man with a fish on his breast laughed. Ravens taking wing with letters to ears that already knew. Ned caught the name of his son sometimes. Sparks struck off steel, and kept his face a stone. He was a brother soon. His children walked in him. They would remain there in a place the vow could not reach. One evening the sky went low and bruised, and the wind smelled of the rain that would not fall. As if summoned by that scent, riders came from the north wearing black that had seen better soap. They were brothers, and Ned knew them even before Yoren raised his hand and hailed them. Before he saw the patchwork of mended wool and old leather and the faces that had been scoured of anything excessive. They shook hands with Yoren, thumped backs. They took the recruits like men receiving a hard harvest. "You're the one," a rangy brother with a walrus mustache said to Ned without making it a question. "Your grace pardons us for short courtesies. You'll be sworn before the old bear if you arrive with breath." "Jeor Mormont still commands," Ned said. "Aye," said the man, "and he'll like your name until he has to scold you for carrying wood like a lord." They made faster going with horses that knew the route. At a ford, Ned dismounted to lead his horse through, and the water reached for his boots with cold hands that were almost welcome. He felt the river try to pull the ground from under him and thought of another river, in a time when he had marched with banners and brothers and men who would be names by now on stones. He looked north and felt something return to him that he had not noticed missing until the moment it slid back into place. The orientation of the world where the cold was a fact, not an insult. The first glimpse of the wall was a trick of light. It came as a line on the horizon where it seemed the sky had fallen and could not get up again. As they drew closer, the line became a cliff of pale, sullen blue that ate the sky. It had weight. It had quiet. It had a presence that made men adjust their belts and shut their mouths and look anywhere but directly at it. Shadows pooled at its base like prayer. Castle Black crouched before it like a homely dog. Smoke rose from chimneys and the clang of a hammer echoed. Ned wore his hood down then. He rode under the shadow of the Black Gate with a thought like a bell in his head. Here, finally, he was not required to dress his honor in the court's new fashions or his words in lies. Here the cold would strip him and leave what he was. That could be mercy. That could be terror. They took him to the armory first, because the wall ordered the world according to what could be lifted and done. Donal Noy, one-armed and thick as a tree stump, gave him a look that measured men to the grain. "My lord," he said without ceremony and without mockery, "you'll be wanting wool, not pride." "To think," Ned said dryly, "that I was eager to be rid of both." Noy found him layers. He found him a place in the yard to stand under a sky that had no interest in making men feel small, not when the wall already managed that. He put a practiced sword in Ned's hand and let him find how much age and South had gnawed at his skills. Jon was not in the yard. The absence rang in him until he remembered that this place was not his to stride across looking for sons. They summoned him to the hall when Jeor Mormont could see him. The old bear was what a bear would be if it lived by human war and winter. He rose to greet Ned as if the wall itself had petitioned him to stand straighter. "Stark," he said, "so the South has learned there are other ways to be rid of a dangerous man." "Better that they send me to where the wind can make a case," Ned said. "You're not wrong, Mor," Mont answered. "You're not often wrong, if what I've heard is true. Sit. You know Maester Eamon." The old man sat in his corner by the hearth, eyes cloudy, a face turned in the direction of voices as if it could feel where words went. He smiled when Ned's name was spoken. Ned bowed. They spoke of oath and service, of the days measured in a different currency than gold. They did not speak of King's Landing, because both men knew the only thing that would come of that was an old anger made new, and the wall did not run on anger. Ned spent his words frugally. The old bear wasted none. When they rose, Mormont said, "You'll swear at the weirwood, as your fathers did. You'll be given duty. You will not be given a lord's quarter." "I did not expect one," Ned said. A boy came to lead him outside, and as they left the hall's smoke another figure stepped into the yard with breath still white from exertion and hair blown wild. Jon had a blade in his hand for practice and astonishment in the other. He stopped as if the yard had galloped backward around him to fetch this sight. Ned did not move as a lord might, with arms wide and words like a benediction. He simply stood until his son crossed the yard with something like fear and like joy and like a man walking to his own trial. The shadow of the wall lay across them both. "Father," Jon said thickly. Ned put a hand on his shoulder. He felt the old constellation of bones and habit. The child's weight ghosted within the man's. "I took the black to keep breath in me," he said plain. "But I would have come north if they'd given me death. There are things that need doing here that no court will ever understand." They said, Jon began and stopped. They said mercy was shown. "Do not lean on that word," Ned said. "It sways under you." He looked into his son's face and saw Catelyn's distance and his own reserve, the Stark in him like a frost line under skin, and the other thing too, the spark that came of some other fire. "We will speak as brothers speak here, not as lord and son." Jon nodded once. He swallowed. "You'll swear." "I'll swear," Ned said. "I'll give them what time remains to me, and when the wind cuts, I'll know I'm not a guest." They walked to the grove. The weirwood was a pale old thing, bleeding its slow red tears into a ground that had tasted them for centuries. Ned had knelt under other faces carved like that, the mouth and eyes made by the same patient blade. He had not been a boy under such a stare for a long time. He knelt now, and the words came from him not like recitation but like breath that had been stored and finally let out. He gave up land and titles in sound and bone. He asked for night. He promised to hold against cold and worse things than cold. When he rose, the wall seemed closer and farther both, the way a mountain does after the first switchback. The hall gave him a bowl of stew and a place by the long table and work that did not allow for thought. The day's labor burned him down to the simple shape beneath the Lord's clothes. He slept in a narrow bed and woke to an air that bit his nose and a long blast of a horn from the west road. His first days were measured in the small coin of chores. He learned where the drafts came through the board walls and how to bank a fire so it might last into the gray of morning. He learned that dolorous Ed spoke as if misery were a craft he had apprenticed to. He learned that Gren snored a tune and that PYP could make a joke from a single syllable and weep 2 hours later over a broken bowstring. He learned that Alistair Thorne could cut a man to the bone with a handful of words, but that the wall was not moved by such knives. He chopped wood until his shoulders sang, carried water until his hands were raw. He stood in the cold and his breath clouded, and he looked out from the top of the wall at a country with no roads, no farms, no lights. He watched the haunted forest. He did not ask for rank, and Mormont did not offer any. Men saw who he was in how he carried the weight he had chosen. That was enough. News came like ravens. Robb had broken a host by the Whispering Wood. A lion had woken to find his tail caught. The riverlands burned. Winterfell sent south whatever it could scrape from its cellars to feed men who never saw it. Catelyn had been seen in Riverrun's hall. Jaime Lannister sat in a cell that smelled of old straw, and the great Jon had laughed until he coughed when he told the tale. Ned read none of it on parchment. He learned by listening to the way the old bear's mouth tightened, to the way Maester Aemon's blind gaze tilted when men spoke names like stones skipping, too fast, too soon over water. One evening, snow-threatening but not committed, Jon came to him at the foot of the stairs up the wall. "Robb writes," Jon said quietly. "He says Mother is at Riverrun. He says they have taken the Kingslayer." "That will ease no heart," Ned said, "but it will make some mouths quieter." He saw the question in Jon. Could they send him back? Could the North be made whole by the return of a man who now had sworn in the Weirwood Grove? He shook his head. "I did not ask," Jon murmured. I thought if he knew you lived." "Do not write it on the wind," Ned said. "I live, and that is a burden I have chosen. Robb will be lord enough without a father's shadow reaching across the snows to move his pawns. If he asks me counsel from a distance, I will give it without ordering his feet. But I do not think he will ask. He is my son, and sons must stand. Jon stared at the dead, pale sky. He will not. They will not cry me home. They could not if they wished, Ned said gently. Your path lies in front of you on this wall. There will be plenty here to call you, and more to try to scrape you away. The call came soon. The old bear summoned him not to talk but to point at a map. We ride, Mormont said. We ride to look the forest in the teeth. I'll see what's there. With my own eyes, not through tales of children and ghosts. Assembly at dawn. See Noi for mail that won't fall off you like a lordling's favor. Ned felt, in some deep part of himself that had once moved under banners, the old readiness rise like a dark tide. He had thought to spend his last years mending things, not leaving trails on snow that wolves could read. But the watch went out or the watch rotted. He strapped on what the armory could spare and said nothing when Thorn threw him a look that said soft old nobles broke easy. They rode under a sky that could not choose between weather. The haunted forest was a white-limbed thing, and their breath went ahead of them like scouts. Corin Halfhand joined them farther west, his face cut by wind and a hand missing fingers as if they had been rent by the cold itself. He nodded to Ned and wasted no words on courtesy. The first dead man they found was a ranger with blue in his lips that was not the cold's color. They burned him with what they had and sent a raven with the smoke. Ned saw Jon's face in the watchfire as the boy fed branches into it. There were times when young men looked like all the children they had ever been. This was one, and Ned nearly called him by a small name. He didn't. He told him to sleep. In his own blankets he watched the stars appear like salt spilled slowly and then all at once. He thought of Caitlin at Riverrun speaking to men whose hair had gone white. He thought of Sansa under the eyes of a court. He thought, reluctantly, of Arya as a small, stubborn flame that might be in motion somewhere under this same sky, stubborn enough to survive. Craster's Keep was a stain of heat in the cold. The man himself smelled of old goat and something that had never been taught a word. He offered hospitality with a count of girls' eyes behind him and a small laugh. Ned swallowed his pity like a stone. It sat hard in him as Mormont traded old news for meat and the right to sleep with a roof over them. And when a thin girl with hands like twigs brought him a bowl, he felt the wrongness like a knife in his palm. Later he spoke low to the old bear by the fire. "This is filth," he said. "We shelter in a midden. And the midden has a roof and keeps the wind off," Mormont said. "I know what you want to do, Stark. I have wanted to do it for years. But the wall has been served better by our stomachs than our hearts in this one thing. If you break it knowing it will break something back." Ned looked over the old bear's shoulder and saw the girl again, a belly notched like a cup and eyes that had been taught not to stare. He looked at Jon, who held his rage like a blade in an oven, slowly changing color. "We will answer for it, one way or another," Ned said. "The North does not forget its debts." "We answer for many things," Mormont said, eyes like iron. "Pick which one you can afford tonight."
Ned slept badly.
In the morning he woke to the sound of Samwell Tarly retching behind a shed, and to the smell of wood smoke, and to a sky bone-white with a promise it would keep. When they left Craster's and the girl's eyes watched them go, he felt a cut in his back he knew he had given himself. Corin took men as if from a quiver and set off to harry the fringes of something that was coalescing like storm. He chose Jon because of course he did. Ned argued with him without theatrics. "He's still green," he said. "He's green with something the cold can't rot," Corin said. "You can see it. But if he breaks, better he breaks where he can be remade, not at the gate with the world falling behind him. He'll come back if he can. If he can't, we count him among the price. The Watch has always counted young bones in its reckoning." Ned looked at Jon. He wanted to put a hand on his son's head and speak sense and shelter into him. Instead he said, "Do as you're told by men who've learned not to die. If you must disobey, disobey like a man who knows what rope will be cut by it." Jon's mouth tightened. "Yes," he said, and there were a dozen words beneath that one. He went with Corin and the wind ate their shadows. Winter's false starts became winter's long arm. The forest sang with a high, cruel music. At the fist of the first men, the Black brothers found old stones that meant less to them now than a downed tree for a fire. They built their camp and their confidence, and they watched the cold with eyes that were often too human for what it required. The night the dead came was a thing Ned had spent half a lifetime telling himself belonged to stories told when ale ran low. He learned again the old truth that stories carved into men because they were trying to tell the shape of the world. They came soundless across snow that should have complained. Men who had been men with names and gripes and dirty jokes and small loves rose with eyes like glacier light. Ned killed one that had been hatched with fingers that could not let go of a sword handle, and the thing moved as if the blade did not trouble it until fire took it. A horse screamed like a broken hinge. Somewhere Ned heard Mormont bellowing orders and someone else praying in a voice like torn cloth. The world shrank to what was in front of his blade. The wind cut. The dead did not tire. He felt age move into his arm like ice, locking his elbow, and then something in him moved past it because he could not stop so long as anything breathed behind him. They held that first terrible rush. Then the sky lightened as if the day had reconsidered them. The dead melted back, or they had never been. It was hard to tell where they went because the air itself seemed to have a mind. Brothers stood breathing like men who had run from their lives. Men with bites on their arms looked down and didn't say anything yet. "We move," Mormont said, no more breath than he needed. "We move now. We leave what we cannot carry and we count who we cannot carry later." Men who had been soldiers once nodded, "Bika." They knew that logic and had made it before about food and dead brothers and names they loved. The retreat felt more like an argument with the forest than a movement through it. Trees stood where they had not the day before. Paths that had seemed clear vanished under a special kind of snow that fell without landing. Men lost fingers and then count of their steps. The old bear stood like a stump with iron bands around it and kept going. Ned put one boot in front of the other and felt the wall pull him like a lodestone. He thought of the truth he had spoken in the September and knew that it had brought him here, to this place where lies would have no purchase anyway. The Crasters again, men snapped like old rope. One brother with eyes that had been kind cut their host's throat in a drunken fury while the man laughed and bled. That blood curdled 100 grudges at once. The mutiny rose like a brush fire. Ned moved before thought. He found the man with the knife and took it from him not as a lord might, but as a black brother who had seen the measure of a trouble. He drove him back with his shoulder, barking words that were orders without being the old bear's words. "Stop," he said, but not in the tone men seldom believed. He said it in an old winter voice, and it slowed some. He grabbed the wrist of another who had lifted an axe to crack a skull in the name of a justice that would unravel them. "We are the wall," he said, and there was nothing noble in it, only cold fact. "If we break here, there is no we left to break later." Men glared with hunger in their eyes. Somewhere a girl wept. Jeor Mormont pushed to the fore with a shove like a boulder dislodged and took the room back by standing in it. Ned looked at him and saw gratitude that would never be said aloud, because men like Mormont did not spend breath on thanks when there were still fires to keep lit. They buried Craster in the yard he had salted with his sins. They left faster than they should have. The girls stood in a huddle and watched them go as if they were watching the last fence against wolves tumble. They stumbled into Castle Black like a tide that had finally conceded the shore. Men ran to see who had made it. Ned stood in the courtyard and saw he would have to sit soon or fall. He sat. He was dimly aware of his son's hand on his arm. He let himself lean, just for a moment, into the heat of that grip. Ravens had beat them home with their stories. Mormont sent birds out anyway, stubbornly, as if he could make the world hear the tale by repeating it. He told the brothers what the forest held and what had walked at night. Even the ones who had not made the ranging believed him because the men standing in front of them had the look of men who had met a cliff and argued it into moving. Soon enough, the wildlings massed on the wrong side of the wall like storm clouds that wanted to be land. John returned from the wilderness with eyes that had looked too long at a life that was not exactly a lie and had broken himself and a woman's heart to become what he had sworn. He told Ned about it with as few words as he could find that would still do. "She would have killed me," John said, "but she couldn't. Then she tried. or tried to try, and He stopped, mouth a line. You came home, Ned said, and a part of you will never forgive you for it. Do not ask that part to bury itself. Let it live in a room. The wall is a fortress with many rooms. She said I knew nothing, John said, and it was a confession and a defense and something softer-edged too. You knew enough to bring your feet to the gate, Ned said. For now, that will have to do. The wall shook under the first assault like a drum struck by giants. They threw themselves against it with ladders that cracked under their own weight and with audacity that would have seemed almost admirable in another story. At the same time, a band slid south, their boots as quiet as gilt, to raid behind and open gates that had been shut so long the hinges had names. Ned found himself on an inner stair with his sword wet and his arm gone to a kind of numbness that was different from the good numbness of cold. This was the numbness of a line crossed between endurance and exhaustion. He fought beside a butcher's son who died after the fight was done, because sometimes the heart simply learned it had been too brave and refused the lesson. He watched John, on a tower top, make decisions men twice his age would have balked at. He watched men fall and be replaced, sometimes by boys. He saw the first of the wildlings to seize the top of a ladder, a man with a horned headdress and eyes like a hawk, stare at him across a strip of air with something like respect and step down again, as if they had made a bargain in a glance. He saw her, too, the red-haired archer whose arrow worked like a thought. She put a shaft into his son's shoulder as if she were sending a letter, and then she was looking at John as if the words she had written could be read from that distance. The moment hung between them, the arrow and all the years on either side of it, and Ned looked away because some moments were too intimate even for fathers. When the dawn came creaking up like an old door, the wall had held. The wildling army shifted and made itself into something like a different kind of storm. The horn blasts that came then were not theirs. The sound was like a thing with a cuirass bursting out of the trees. Stannis Baratheon's banners looked wrong in that white landscape until the men beneath them began to do what they always did. Move like a law no one could repeal. They fell upon the wildling host with the grim gravity that had marked them on other fields. Ned watched the charge from the top of the wall, exhaustion like a fog in his bones, and saw one small man within the fury who could only be Davos Seaworth, because the way he moved through men and choices was a way you learned only by surviving disasters. Hen the red and gold were broken, when Mance Rayder stood among men who were suddenly without a banner and surrendered with a king's simple economy. Stannis rode into Castle Black with cold iron in his eyes and the knowledge that this victory would be weighted and measured by men who had not been there. He dismounted as if the ground had to answer to him. He looked up at the wall and then down at the Black brothers gathered with their scars and their breath still hard. He took in Ned Stark as a fact to be accounted for, not a surprise. They had ridden under the same storms once, and each now wore a different sort of winter. Eddard, Stannis said. He made no court flourish of it. Stannis, Ned answered, inclined his head. He would not kneel. No one here would, and Stannis did not expect it. That was one thing to recommend him above many kings. You chose well not to die for a boy's whim, Stannis said. His closeness made the air colder, somehow. You have chosen to stand where men should stand. I will require the north. You'll require much, Ned said, because something in him had thought enough to make a dry joke at least. He sobered. The north will require you to see this place for what it is. The threat you threw your strength against today is not the only one coming, nor the worst. Stannis's mouth was made for decisions, not smiles. I have seen. I am not blind. I will hold this wall, and I will require from the north what is owed to the realm. I cannot bargain for lords, Ned said. I cannot bargain for my own son. I cannot bargain at all, as I am nothing now except what I have sworn. But I can tell you what snow tells pine. If you break here, all the trees fall. Stannis nodded once. I have not come to break. I have come to set something right if it will be set. They stood with the wall at their backs and a captured king beyond the gate and a war in the south that had not ceased because the cold had asked for attention. Ned felt for a strange, steady moment that something iron in the world had aligned. Not politics, not pride, just the unavoidable arithmetic of survival. Days found their new grooves. Men were flogged for abandoning posts, for stealing, for things that were smaller sins in the South and larger here. The watch counted furs and bread and arrows as if they were rubies. The wildlings were gathered, sorted, frightened into lines that might become something else. John healed, the scar a mark at the incident's center, and turned his face with that stubborn set of the mouth that looked like his father's at 17 toward whatever was next. Ned watched him and allowed himself the ache that came whenever he got a sudden flash of a boy running through snow up to his knees with a wooden sword, because some pains were proof that bone had knit properly. Then there were elections. The old bear had been salt and bone long before the forest tried to scrape him clean. He did not speak of stepping down, but his cough spoke for him at last, and he let Eamon call the brothers to the yard. Names were said that weighed differently in different mouths. Alistair Thorne's voice carried like a creek men had learned to ignore. Cotter Pike's had the sea in it, even here. Dennis Mallister's had silk that had survived moths. No one said Eddard Stark at first, because no one liked to say the name that would make half the men stand straighter and half shrink their shoulders, the name that had been a lordly banner long before it wrapped itself around a vow. But the watch was also a place where the most obvious labor sometimes took the longest to begin. It came eventually, from a brother with no more pretension than a slice of bread. He said, "We'll need a winter man." And then, as if to put meat on the bone so everyone could see what was meant, "Lord Stark." There were murmurs, the familiar and greedy kind. Jeor Mormont sat until the noise tired itself out, then stood. "If he is chosen," he rasped, "he will be chosen for what he is now, not for what he was south of us. If he breaks in a way that breaks the wall, he will be hauled down from that chair by his heels same as any man. Think before you throw his name to the wind." Ned did not look at John. He did not look at anyone. He stood as if he were listening to a far bird. When they came to him later in a corner of the yard, men with oil and a handful of respect, and said it seemed a choice made of snow and iron, he said, "If you choose me, I will take it. I will not take it because I want it. Want is a poor hand on this wall. I will take it because the things we have seen have taught me the only thing I care to hold anymore is the keeping of this line." He was chosen, not cleanly, nothing here was clean, but with a weight of voices you could feel in your knees. He took the black cloak that would not warm him and put it over a shoulder that had known fur that had. He sat in the Lord Commander's chair and felt its unpleasant comfort. It was a seat made for men to die out of and be replaced in, quick and without hissed epics. He did what men in that chair did. He counted grain and curses. He spoke to Mance Rayder, the other king, and listened to the tale of why a wildling who had worn a cloak once would break the wall in the only direction that made sense to him. He took the measure of Tormund, whose laugh could rattle icicles without melting them. He looked at a woman from beyond the wall whose eyes had already buried 4 sons and wanted nothing of men's frets about lineage and wolves and lions. He decided that what you called people mattered less than whether they starved. He took their numbers and placed them and withstood Alistair's turn of phrase and let Stannis and his queens read which do their theater on a stage. He could not afford to leave. He held John short when he needed to and gave him rope when the boy looked furious at leashes. When Janos Slint arrived one cold morning with a face that had learned to make sneers int. "Oh, maskwork," sent away from King's Landing by a dwarf who understood something about the economy of exile and replacement, Ned looked at him and saw a flash of a rope and a raised hand in a different square. He remembered a sword that no longer existed except as 2 new things, smaller, less true. He remembered gold cloaks turning and the way a boy king's lip had curled. He found in himself not the old hot desire for revenge but the cooler, cleaner need to make the watch hold to itself. He gave Slint orders like any other man. When Slint disobeyed, loudly and with that old belief that the world would shape itself to him because it had once done so, Ned sent for the swing of an axe that cut through wood and arrogance alike. He did not lift the blade himself. He had sworn to be Lord Commander, not headsman. He let John do what needed doing when Slint refused the rope and thought himself beyond it. The letter that came with winter like unrolled parchment bore no seal-needed explanation. Caitlyn's words were scant. A river managed down to a thread by stones. She told him that Robb had not taken a crown, because the men had raged and then counted and then decided to call him warden for now, that the Freys had played the bridge keeper and extracted vows like taxes, that Jaime remained in a cell, that Sansa had been forced to wed a Lannister who had not hurt her and that this was a small and ungainly mercy, that Theon had gone to Pike with letters like offerings and returned to the north with free men who took what was not theirs. Winterfell, she wrote, and the word did not hold all it was, no more than father ever had. He took Winterfell while boys looked to his face and could not see what he truly was. Bran and Rickon. The ink blotted there. When it resumed, her hand was steady. The miller's sons died in their place. I pray for them. I pray for him and curse him. I do not know if prayer and curse cancel or compound. Ned folded the letter and did not sleep a whole night for a week. He watched Jon on the parapets and thought of that small boy running in the yard. He thought of a different small boy, last of a dead rain, stumbling through a dungeon smelling like straw. He thought of a different boy again, Theon Greyjoy with all his nerve and talk, the boy Ned had kept like a blade in a sheath that did not feel it would fit. "Will you write her?" Jon asked, standing with him in silence that did more service than words. "I will write her," Ned said, "and I will send along nothing that would make her feel it was my hand pulling at her hem. She stands among wolves and fish and men who put on lion skins when they want to feel like something other than themselves. She does not need me to tell her where to put her feet." He wrote Catelyn that he was alive and would remain so if he could. He wrote Robb nothing. He wrote Sansa, though no letter would reach her, because sometimes sending words into the world was itself an act with its own kind of magic, and perhaps a raven would err into the right window. He wrote Arya nothing because to write to a wind is to make paper damp. He wrote Bran and Rickon's names into the fire and watched them curl and go black and leave something behind that could not be named. The winter set in earnest. It had a long, regular patience like a man counting coins in a room alone. Men grew quiet who had been loud in their thoughts. The wall took them into itself and made them useful where it could. Stannis remained, a dark mark in the margins of every plan, sometimes helping, sometimes simply happening, always insisting and always holding that insistence up like a standard. The Red Woman walked the yard like a thought most men did not want to follow to its end. At night the cold settled with a hand on Ned's chest like a father willing his son quiet. He slept badly and enough. There was a day when a little boy from the Gift who had never seen snow so deep, he had to lift his knees to walk in it, stood in the yard and stared up at the wall until his neck hurt. He said, "It looks like it goes to the sky." "It does," Ned told him. "It doesn't keep things from falling. It teaches things to fall properly." The boy did not understand and nodded as if he did and ran away to throw snow at another boy's ear. Ned watched them and thought that if the wall could be held it would be by such small foolishness as much as by any noble oath. Oaths held men up. Laughter made it easier to breathe. He had dreamed sometimes, in those early days of Robert's rebellion, of what the North might be if given to him whole and allowed to be itself. He had thought in simple lines because he had been young and simple lines are honest until the world bends them. Now his mind moved in knots and unknotted them as a means of getting through to the next morning. He would die here, he thought, if death found him, and that would be no betrayal of Winterfell. He would die with his back to the wall and his face north, the way a Stark should. When the Raven came most mornings it brought ordinary ugliness. Disputes about woodlets, a brother complaining of another brother's bad breath and laziness, Stannis demanding a tally of things he had no patience to tally himself, a plea from a village with a collapsed barn. Now and then it brought news that was like frost on the inside of a window, fresh and unwelcome. One morning it brought a letter in a hand he did not recognize and a seal he had not seen since he was a young man with a sword he did not yet understand was too heavy for one hand. He broke it and read Stannis's declaration that the boy on the Iron Throne was the child of his sister and her twin, that septs across the realm must hear it until it lay in every ear like a seed. He held the parchment, and the truth felt old and cutting and cheap, as if it were a coin that had been taken through too many hands. He could do nothing with it here except what he could already do, hold a line. He held it. He stood the watch up in front of the dark. He married practicality to stubbornness and let the children be wed under the old gods when fathers could be found, or by Maester Eamon if none could, because sometimes love itself had to be declared in defiance of cold. He looked at the wildlings and saw men who would die under a new flag or an old one and not know the difference until it came for their children. He kept John near enough to correct and far enough to let him grow. He looked south sometimes with a kind of dull ache and then turned north again because north was all that could be worked at like a knot. When the spring did not come, when the cold settled its weight and said it would only lift when it was satisfied with itself, Ned felt for the first time a warmth that was not of fire. It came of the knowledge that he had chosen well where choice had been offered. He had refused to wrap truth in a lie even to save his own neck. He had taken the black not as a coward's dodge but as a man's last act of fidelity to a set of words he had trained sons on. The consequence had been snow and breath and bread counted in rough hands and a long line that ran across a world. It was enough. On a night when the aurora stuttered green and pale against the black above the wall, a boy with hair newly grown out stood one-armed with a spear he had shaped himself and said he had dreamed of summer. Another boy laughed and said that was a good thing to dream of, and then they turned because the horn was sounding. Ned looked out into the forest, where the light played false on branches and men's breath ghosted like the shapes of vanished loves. He held up a hand and men became quiet not out of fear but because they had learned to listen. He spoke because speaking was part of what the wall asked of men, and men needed words the way they needed heat. He told them what they were, and what hungering things were not, and what lines could be held by hands willing to be colder than fear. He said nothing heroic. He said only what was necessary, and then he lifted his sword. Winter lay in front of him like a long road. He set his foot on it and leaned his weight into the first step. The horn's second note bit the air cleanly enough to make the marrow prickle. Men lifted their heads as one because the body knew what sound meant long before the mind gave it language. Ned turned and let the cold take his face fully, the better to hear it without the muddle of breath in his scarf. The wind had a knife's edge and the aurora above rippled its green into threads too delicate for sewing. He could taste the metal in the cold and the old, absolute purity of a night that looked south at men and found their heat and impertinence. "West watch," Dolorous Ed muttered, as if he'd been particularly offended by that direction when he was a child and had never forgiven it. "I always fancied east would fail first. My luck doesn't even keep its own counsel." "Riders?" John asked, near enough that Ned could see how the half-healed scar pulled when he set his jaw. "Not riders." Ned's mouth had gone to a thin line without his bidding. "Listen for the third." It came low and harsh as if forced through a throat that had disused sound. The old dread answered it in men's bellies. Brothers glanced at one another and then looked north because that was where their glances must go. There was no other ritual left to them. In the still after the blast, Ned could hear the small sounds men made when they were trying not to admit fear. Leather creak, a throat clearing with ostentatious casualness, a sword tested in its scabbard and then reseated as if to say there had been no doubt it would come free. "Open the gate," Ned said. "Manners cost nothing. If they come, we greet them properly." He heard boots move and felt the great chain groan through the stone. Castle Black smelled of smoke and old wool and iron. Beyond the gate the night smelled of nothing and dared anything to try to add a note to it. Stannis was in the yard already, the set of his shoulders as precise as if a sculptor had given him angles instead of flesh. The Red Woman stood a step behind with her hands folded as if the wind, which spared no one, had some separate generosity toward her. Davos Seaworth, the missing fingers shaping his grip on the hilt that wasn't drawn, met Ned's eye and nodded once. Men like that exchanged only what there was time for. All else could be told later or not at all. They waited, and waiting was a kind of fight. The gate stood a black mouth with the teeth of the portcullis drawn back and the wall above a mast dark enough to remake the sky. The third horn had been for the dead and everyone knew it, though the old stories had been told to make boys' hair stand for a laugh by fires that burned a little cleaner once the laughter started. The stories had lied only about the laughter. The dark did not move and then it did. An edge of snow came in as if it had been given shape around something. A figure crossed from the black into the lesser black of torchlight and became a man with a beard gone to ice, eyes like glass and that old, appalling steadiness possessed only by those who did not intend to mention their fear until later. Ranger, one of the men breathed, and though there was no need to say it, sometimes it steadied men to give a thing its name. The ranger's lips cracked when he smiled. Not alone, he said. The words snapped in the cold. He half-turned, and others staggered under the arch. 3 brothers with their mail stiff with frost and a child clutched in the forearms of one. Wildling, by the look of him, hair a dirty straw that had had sun in it once and could not remember now. The child's eyes were too dark for that little face, and so round Ned could not avoid the memory of another round and small Rickon, always rudely intact, always careening toward a fire with a fist of bread. Close, Ned said gently, and men hoo-ha. Deebin, poised to run to the bodies, ran to the gate instead because the first duty is sometimes to doors. The portcullis teeth bit down on air. The great timbers thunked like heartbeats. In the flare of torches, the ranger's face resolved into a man he knew. Hey, too young to be so worn. Once glib with a joke that didn't bite. What did you see? Light? Hay said, and shook once as if to dislodge the memory. Like snow off a cloak. Blue, but not from any god I know. Men who were men once. He swallowed. Something else behind them. Like the cold had made itself into a blade and wanted to learn walking. We'll learn it back, Ned said. He put a hand on the man's shoulder. Hay flinched only a little. Hot wine. Get him out of those skins. He squatted in front of the wildling child. Who are you? The boy had the stubborn set of a child whose answer would be the last thing he yielded. Crowkiller's son, he said at last, a small flame that wanted to be ablaze. No, Ned said, without heat. That's something you were born out of. It isn't a thing you are. He lifted the boy as if his bones were too light to trust. We'll call you, he stopped. Names are ropes. Best not to tie one until you were sure it would not strangle. We'll call you boy until morning. The rule of a long garrison is this. Terror arrives, eats what it can, moves on. What remains must be put back in order as if it had only been wind. Men took the ranger to a bench by the fire and stripped him to steam. The child was cradled by a woman whose hands were cracked from cold and care. One of the wildlings set to work in the kitchens who had learned the names for spices faster than the men had learned the names of her dead. Plans were made and unmade in voices that did not rise. Stannis watched with that hard, parsimonious gaze that could be stingy with admiration, and with the moments he allowed himself to acknowledge, he was watching men do his realm's work without needing his name to be spoken into it. Lord Commander Stark, he said when the lesser tasks were assigned, and only the larger lay between them like a table with a single-course loaf. We will strike before the dark finds its feet again. We will not chase the dark into itself like men who still believe days shorten only for sport, Ned answered. We hold. We make ready. If they come, we make their first taste bitter. Caution is a disguise men wear when they are not brave enough to be bold, Melisandre murmured. Her voice had been wound by a craftsman to sound like smoke rising. Boldness is sometimes a disguise men wear when they are afraid to think, Ned said, because the old priest in Winterfell had taught him that piety without argument grows soft, and he had found it a useful rule for war as well. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked up the length of the wall as if to gather counsel from that old enormous spine. The night did not force their hand. It lay against the timbers like a cat before a hearth that has ceased to give heat, not sure if it has been cheated of something owed. Men went back to their bunks with their swords close, too sober to squander sleep. Ned slept in a chair with his cloak over him like a poor man's banner and woke to the sky the color of old milk and men moving with that keen, quick quiet of those who knew they would be moving all day. By the noon meal word had spread to the furthest corners where brothers took their bread to eat it alone. The dead had come to Westwatch's outskirts and not pressed. They had tested. That was worse. The testing meant they remembered learning. The word crawled down spines and settled in lower backs. Men's work around the yard was a little too efficient in spots, as if to make a bulwark out of well-swept stones. Ned did not speak to set them right. He went up the wall and let his breath frost the wood of the handrail as if he were someone else, someone merely out to look at distance for its own sake. He carried a dragonglass dagger in his belt because he was not a fool, and he had loaned 3 dozen to men who could be trusted to hold them and hand them to the right hands at the right moment. Obsidian's gloss held light as if it were remembering something older than fire. Sam Tarley had told him the story in the way some men confess, relieved and ashamed and a little joyful. The blade had gone into an other, and the other had made the sound a man makes when he first feels winter find the back of his neck in earnest. That had been on a night when the forest had more voices than men. Now Sam was away, his journeys rolling under him like a sleepless ship, taking Eamon and a baby whose life had been counted twice by two mothers who could not be asked to give up one more measure of grief. They had made that exchange in the dim before dawn, in the shadow of Stannis's lodges, with Davos as witness and the law as shield. "No burnings on my side of the wall," Ned had said, and Stannis had measured him and found the measure right and nodded once. Melisandre had watched with an expression that did not acknowledge that men were moving for reasons that would not fit into her fire's grammar. Gilly wept quietly and did not stop for an hour after the men with the bundle rode out. The other woman bent her head and did not weep at all, which was worse. "They'll be taken south where the air is kinder," Ned had told them, and women had the right to call a lie that had no place to be true. They did not call him liar. They held the lie like a sheet over their shoulders and made its warmth. That was the kind of mercy the wall had to afford or concede everything else. The wind shoved him as he stood above the world. Jon came up beside him and looked. Boy and man could have stood a long time like that without speaking. The wall allows for silence because silence is another way of naming what men know. When Jon spoke, it was because he had gathered the thread of what needed saying and not. "Diet. Corrin's map ends at a tree that isn't there anymore," he said. "Tormund says the dead do not mind cliffs. They will learn to climb if climbing becomes an idea they find agreeable." "You will lead the next party west to look," Ned said. Jon's mouth twitched. "I thought you might write that line for me." "You've written enough lines. Write one more. Take men who will think and men who will obey and two who will do neither but are worth keeping in sight." "You put Thorn in the third?" "I said worth keeping in sight." Jon made the soft sound that was nearest laughter dared on the top of the wall. "He knows I am not the boy he mocked when he thought mockery would make a man faster than need would," he said, something like pity in the phrasing that had no pity in the content. "He hates me for it in a way no blade ever taught him." "Then make him useful," Ned answered. "Nothing deflects spite like utility." Jon leaned his forearms on the rail, his breath warming the wood for the next gust of cold to erase. "If the dead are scouting, they'll know the terrain better than we do within a fortnight. The difference between a soldier and a man is that the soldier works even when he knows the odds," Ned said. "We'll not be caught waiting to be taught our own gate's latch." He did not go with Jon because duty shackled him in the chair with the worn arms and the maps that had learned to wear dirt in their creases. He watched the yard, because sometimes leadership is simply the work of keeping pieces moving so that when a man returns for wood or bread it is there and his hands do not find only the memory of it. He wrote to White Harbor and made the words spare and clean. He did not request. He said what was needed. He let Wyman Manderley infer the rest, because clever men are more eager to complete a picture when allowed the flattery of thinking it started as their own. He wrote to Carhold and sent the letter with a crow that had survived 2 winters and was therefore already a hard argument in feather. He wrote to the Umbers and knew the letter would be read out loud and possibly to the rhythm of a drinking song before it was carried. Forever after, stuffed in a boot. He wrote none to the Dreadfort. Letters there were read by a man who made words into traps. He did not leave tracks in that snow. Word out of the south came irregular and too flavored with the mouths it had passed. A letter in a precise, feminine hand like a sandpiper's prince told him the boy king had choked on a wedding feast and died purple. The words did not lament. They did not gloat. They had that narrowness common to messages sent by people riding in wagons while corridors of guards keep the world mere anecdote. Said nothing of Sansa. He read that omission 10 times from 10 angles and concluded only that Littlefinger had hold of some string within that tapestry, because when tapestries went still suddenly it was often because a man like him was tugging just enough from behind them to blend. He spoke little of it. He held it inside and let it calcify rather than splinter. He told Jon in a sentence because there was no kindness in keeping news away from a boy whose bones had been built by truth, even when truth tasted like blood. John absorbed it the way the wall absorbed snow from a night storm. It added weight. Nothing changed about its work. Riders came back with frost framed in their brows and the lie of good cheer on their lips, which they dropped at the fire like an unnecessary cloak. They had seen trees bent into arches under a blue not made by the sky. They had seen prints that did not belong to anything that had ever cast a shadow. Thorn cursed and hid that his oath had already called itself into question in the cold, because promises made in a warm hall can be expected to pale under a white world. John spoke in spare phrases, and as he spoke, the plan grew around those words like frost forming on iron. Move the garrisons forward here and here. Set watchfires here. Send Tormund in a hook around like a man checking his own trap. Post men where the sound carries far and honest. The names they used were the names of trees and stones and those old abandoned villages whose doors had been shut so long that snow had adopted them and given them ancestry. When the first true press came against Westwatch, the brothers there were ready enough to live. They stood on skids of old ice that made their toes ache, and the soundlessness of the dead came into their ears like a lie. The first of them, white as a sliver of bad moon, stepped into torchlight, and the torchlight died like a word refused. The man at the front of the line held his arm steady and passed the obsidian forward. He did not know and could not know that his hand would be the one to have found the seam. He only knew that the thing in front of his blade did not sweat and did not doubt. Ned was not there. He was in the yard with the map and the raven's scratch and the old bear's cough and Stannis's hard profile. He felt it when the dead hit the men. There is a rhythm to battle that can be perceived even far away if you've listened to it long enough. A stutter at first, then a pace. He felt the return thunder from his own chest as a man laughed somewhere up there. A full, unlovely bark because the other had come apart like glass hurried into hot water. Dragonglass in the right hand in the right moment. Fear learned quickly. Hope often had to be taught the same lessons over and over. They held Westwatch. They paid too much for that knowledge. He sent men to come in behind and bring the living back down to wood and stew and the little healing that sleep might afford. He had them bring the dead who could not be burned. Some things you do because ritual teaches the hands what to do when the soul falters. Some because you want to tell the men that their bodies are owed by those who still use theirs. He stood by a bier and memorized the line of a lad's mouth, whose name he had learned 2 weeks before. That is a commander's work too. The day after, Tormund came into the hall with snow stratified in his beard like layers in a cake, laughing in a way that made men breathe, because if that big animal of a man could laugh, then perhaps they could survive their own hearts. He flung himself onto a bench. "Hard home," he said without preamble, and the world chilled 2 degrees more inside the hall. He slapped his hand down on the table as if it might help the thought stay still long enough to speak it. They're there by the hundreds, by the thousand, huddled like geese that forgot which way to fly. You can smell the smoke from the sea already. There's a pile of bones as big as some of your halls. They call it a city. I've seen beaver dams built with more love. But there's children. He thumped his chest. And old ones who can still pick berries when the time comes, and girls that sing when they think no one hears. They'll die if we leave them, and then they'll stand and come for us. Either way, you'll see their faces. The word Hardhome had always tasted of bad luck and black stories. In men's mouths it had salt and ash like the lip of a kettle where old broth had crusted. The eyes turned to Ned were not supplicant. They were those of men asking what the work would be. A few were hostile because some men believe if you rescue anyone not wearing your colors, you have stolen meat from their children. He looked from bench to bench and saw where the weights lay in their scales. "Stannis has ships," someone said. The word like a cloud of breath out of a mouth that didn't like being useful to anyone in red or iron. Davos met Ned's eye again, the little iron smile in his look as reliable as tide. "He does. They are honest tradesmen pressed into soldiering. They will do what you ask so long as the sea does not decide to behave like a lord and grow fickle at a council. And you will take them," Stannis said to Ned with the straightforwardness of a man assigning a charge, as if he were handing a log to the next pair of hands by a woodpile. "No," Ned said, and the word hit the table hard enough some men flinched. "Jon will take them. That boy is a string too taut," Melisandre said, head cocked. She watched men the way cats watch fire, baffled by its inconsistencies, convinced of its allegiance if only she could teach it to purr for her. "He will snap and cut someone you love. He'll hold," Ned said, "because he is not a string. He is chain and has learned which links become weak under what strain." He turned to Jon and did not allow himself to look for the boy under the man. "You will go. Tormund will go with you because no one knows that shore's humors better. You take boats light and many. You do not overfill them. You do not linger for pride. You bring who you can bring. The rest is what winter claims as its tithe." "We'll have to leave some to die," Jon said. He did not make a sound of protest. He stated a fact like a man measuring timber. "You will leave none to die you can bring," Ned said. "You will not make my mistake and try to carry a haul on your back." "It won't be your mistake that kills me," Jon said, and that was the closest they'd ever come to humor in the face of this particular task. They set to it like carpenters. Davos argued with a map until the angles became something ships could live with. Sailors always did this. They were stubborn with lines, but once satisfied, could split hairs with degrees a knight would never notice. He promised half the fleet and said the other half would sulk if they weren't given a chance to show they could hold their course in seas full of hungry ice. He went himself because men like him do not send others into a risk they can calculate and keep their hands clean. Stannis consented because Davos had earned the right to risk his own neck, and because any attempt to forbid him would end with a man rowing a boat angry and still going where he wanted. Ned walked the yard with a list in his head that had to be a list because there was no other way to think when preparing to send men into a tide's appetite. He spoke to the leatherers about how long a boot lasts when it's both wet and cold and moving over stone. He spoke to the cooks about gruel thick enough to stick to the spoon even when breath cooled it too quickly. Their eyes sharpened with the respect that comes when a lord notices what they do is also war. He spoke to boys who would carry messages in the cold and told them the truth, which was that they had as much say in men's living as the ones who would be swinging oars. He watched Thorne move through the preparations like a man searching for a reason to say no and smiled when he failed to find one and wound up ordering rope as efficiently as any other brother. They went at dawn, those boats drawn up like teeth on the iced shore. The oars bit. The sea had a skin of slush that parted unwillingly as if it had to be argued with. Tormund wore a look as serious as a bishop's and then grinned when a wave slapped him as if to bring him to his senses. Jon stood in the stern of one boat and looked backward once. Like a man taking a last measure of a house he's built before leaving a friend in it. Ned lifted a hand because there was nothing else to do that would not make something rattle inside. Then they were in the scrape and hush of the sea, their backs to the wall's harsh comfort. Snow thickened into a fine, mean fall that gathered in the furrow of eyebrows and the iron rings on the gunwales. The sea breathed and the boats breathed back, rising and falling. The men at oars fell into that rhythm that becomes, in time, the only possible time in the world. Davos's voice carried, steady, low, ungilded. Tormund's great laugh went out over water twice, each time half prayer. Hardhome rose from the sea like a scab that had grown too enthusiastic. The cliffs were a line of old teeth. The shingle reeked of fires and older fish, and beyond that lay a sprawl of huts and shelters and an attempt at streets that had never been finished because some men mistake the number of people gathered for a city. Smoke did indeed curl where it should not have, thick and greasy as guilt. The wind had a note in it that was not the sea's. Screams carry over water a certain way. They flatten, the highs cut off first, the lows long. The boats slid up on stones and men spilled out like grain from a slit sack. If the dead were already there in force, they were patient. If they wanted to watch men sweat and then come nearer, they chose well. Jon put men in a line and then in two lines for leading human traffic down to boats that had no patience with chaos. Tormund waded into the mass of wildlings and made his size into a kind of order, slapping shoulders and bellowing and laughing and once cuffing a man who thought the boat might hold just one more and paid for that thought with 3 others tumbling out. A woman shoved a child into Jon's arms as if he were a post she'd tied hope to. He handed the child to another and then another until he could move again, and he did not let himself look at her face because if he did he might try to remember it. Memory too lavish gets men stuck. The dead came quietly and then they didn't. It was like the moment when a thawing river suddenly finds the last of its ice brittle and opens. There is a growl in it, and a rush, and then everything moves. They rose on the far end of the encampment where there had been a line of old whale ribs used for hanging fish to smoke. The first whites slid over those bones like apes. They were under the bones and through them, and then there were more. A man who had been careful with his legs once, and the way he placed them in snow loped in a gait that had nothing in it of caution anymore. An old woman who had always bent from her waist because her back had ached now arched in a way that made the shape of a scream but made no sound. John's command voice did not crack. Back, back, back now, left line first. Davos, hold those boats. No, that one's full, Tormund. Got them, Tormund roared. And he did. Somehow, turning a group of boys into something that wanted to hold rather than break. An other appeared by the stack of driftwood that had been picked over for a season and never exhausted. It was taller than John remembered, and his memory had not been small. Frost formed on the driftwood when it looked at it. A man lifted a sword, and the sword laughed and then shattered, and the man looked at the handle as if betrayed by a friend. John had a dragonglass dagger in his belt. He had 3. He did not reach for them. He had 2 in his hand in the time it takes to say no to a fear. He stepped into the empty space that opens up sometimes around men about to do a thing, and the quiet there held him a second. Then he moved. The dagger skidded out of his hand at the same time as a woman shoved a child toward him, and he adjusted without thinking, and the blade went wide by the width of a breath. Again. Davos's voice came as if he were speaking 3 feet from John's ear and not from a boat aswim in men and choices. Again, boy, there's no prize for doing it once. The other had turned its head to track the slump of the blade in snow as if this object held more interest than the men. When it turned back, John's other hand was moving. The knife went flat and true, not the throw of a soldier. Davos would teach him that later, but that of a boy who had grown up under icicles with stones always in his hands. It struck at the clavicle and bit with that strange quiet, the absence of sound that was somehow louder than any blow. The other stilled, and its head moved by a fraction as if acknowledging a point made. Then the world around it made noise again as it came apart like frost under heel. The line wavered, and then was a line again under voices that were more angle than music. They loaded boats with a savagery that was merely the shape of urgency. Men ran in that without grace gait that comes of having too much to carry in the wrong places, and stayed on their feet anyway because falling would teach death where to find them. Twice, 3 times, John thought, I will turn and run and not stop, because the sea had one language and it was not human, and there was a promise in the horizon that looked like sleep. He did not turn. He took an arm and an elbow and a piece of a door used as a sled and threw all of it into the moment in front of him, and then did it again, because that is how men live inside the lesson the world teaches when it becomes intolerably clear. They left a count of people behind that would have felt like a fraction if any of the ones left had been his enemies. They weren't. They were what winter would have next. He did not let himself count their faces. He did not play back the last clutch of a hand into his sleeve that he had to pull free from so he could save 3. He did not allow the idea of fairness to enter. The sea took the boats back with the indifferent hospitality of a landlord who has already counted the rent twice. When they beached the bow on the wall's side, men fell into the water and got up and did not notice the cold because cold had become a constant, like breath. Ned watched with eyes that did not make mistakes about distance or weight. He counted boats, 1 too long, 1 too much wind, 1 with blood in a line along the gunwale, 1 with Davos's head whipped around in the wrong direction because he was counting another man's fingers, and the ocean always takes its tax personal. He counted men. He counted women. He counted children, and that was the hardest arithmetic because there is no right total that includes the part where a child isn't died and will die. He felt relief come and hated it a little and accepted it because there is no use hating what you must use. Relief is a tool like any other. Make it stand where you want it and keep it from going feral. He did not go to John and ask him if he was hurt. That question becomes a vanity with men who have just returned from a border none of the rest could see and live. He looked, and what he saw told him what he needed. He went to Tormund and squeezed his shoulder and said, "You will drink until the cups wonder if there is any left for them." And that was the award that made sense to a man like that. He met Davos's eye, and Davos looked a calculation that ended with a nod. There had been losses he would speak later in that quiet place where men put the numbers that are only to make other numbers honest. 3 nights later a wagon rolled into the yard with a broken tire and a crew of boys whose hands were raw with the attempt at mending it in snow. A lad with a hat too large pulled low over eyes too cagey came down off the buckboard and looked around Castle Black as if it were a tavern one had been assured was friendly but could not yet be trusted with your back. Ned did not know why his heart left its normal place in his chest and went into his throat until he saw the way the child avoided looking at him when she did not need to avoid him. He knew that avoidance. He had raised it. He did not go to her. He went to the horses and said something to the driver about hubs and grease, and it was several minutes before he said, casually, "Boy, fetch me that line there." And the boy turned like a hawk on a glove and came with the coil as if he had snapped a whip. All the ways he could know his daughter without declaring her unscrolled themselves in him like a map no one else could read. The deliberate dirt under the nails meant to disguise the hand's real work. The weight balanced in the balls of the feet like someone prepared to run and not trip on her own toes. The small scar at the corner of the jaw he remembered and which hot tears had made bigger years ago. Arya looked at him because she had to and then looked away just as quickly. He took the rope. He did not let his hand touch her more than a rope's worth. "You're a handier boy than most," he said. "I watch," the boy said, and that was the sort of truth Arya gave. Less than asked, more than obliged. "Good," Ned said. "Watching saves men work that might otherwise get them killed." He lifted his gaze and it slid over her as if she were a lad like any in the yard. "Need another following the teams. Yoren never taught you to waste a day. Yoren taught me to spit true in the wind and to keep my name in my teeth," she said. And the way she put Yoren's name in her mouth made him close his eyes a second as if he had seen someone fall. Yoren had been a burr in the world's sleeve, and he had caught 1,000 small things and carried them and somehow not been scraped off. The last anyone had had of him was a letter in a hard hand that said only "got 'em past God's eye. Going to have to teach one of 'em to bite the coin." "You're here," Ned said. It slipped out. He had not meant to give that much away. He breathed in through his nose as if the cold were a drug that could steady or stupefy depending on dosage. "I'm here," Arya said. She looked around with an exaggerated slowness that performed boyhood badly and therefore well. "Cold. It is. You'll be taking the black?" she asked. Chin up so it was a joke that could be made into a jest if he took it wrong. "I took it," he said. "It fit better than a crown would have." Arya's mouth did something flicking and quick that would be a smile when she was older and had learned where to shelter it. "Good," she said. "I don't like crowns." "Nor they you," he said softly. If he had been a different man, he would have hidden her in a cellar and stood above it with a sword and cut down any man who thought to look for her in a place that wasn't his business. But he was Eddard Stark, and the Night's Watch had rules that were not simply words. He would not keep a girl under his cloak when the cloak belonged to something larger than his grief. He brought her to a storeroom with a door that stuck because of a swelling in the wood and a window that let in enough light to keep despair from attaching itself to corners. "You will not be called here," he said. "Not by name. You will keep your hair short a while more. You will learn how to carry bread without making the bread ashamed." "I can carry bread." Her mouth flattened. Standing there, she had the sapling tension of someone who had learned to vibrate with held motion rather than shake. "I can run messages. I can stab cockroaches for stew. I can. You can go to Bravos," he said, and watched the words strike her cheek and leave the memory of a hand. He went on before she could bring the wall of no up. "There is a ship. There is a man on that ship who owes me nothing, which is the only reason I would trust him. There is a coin in the world given to those who want to learn how to be no one, and there are men who will answer to it if you say the old words. You need not take it. You can stay here and I will make you safe, insofar as any place is safe now between ice and fire." Her eyes flashed and the wolf that had lived in her since it could fit inside his palm showed its teeth. "I won't be safe," she said, as if it were slightly obscene. "I'll be ready." "You will be ready," he agreed. "You will learn things I do not know how to teach. Perhaps one day, if the world insists on presenting its throat, you will cut it cleanly." He sat on the edge of a barrel because fathers sit when they need their daughters to stand. You will have to go without farewell. Your sister. The word stung a little in his mouth because he had used it more as a charm than a description for so long now. Your sister is south. She is married. She does not write. That is a kind of writing. I will go, Arya said. She said it as if she were choosing between two equally distasteful cuts and had decided which one scraped the pot least. I don't want you to come essay. Why goodbye and then I'll think about it. I don't want you to look sad. I am rarely sad, Ned lied. I am a northerner. We mistake sadness for cold often enough that we do not know when to bring more wood. You'll look sad. She glared to be argumentative because it gave her a better handle on what she felt. You'll smell sad. I'll wash, he said deadpan, and she grimaced, which was a laugh when it did not want to be. He walked her to the yard's edge before dawn, to a cart that would go only as far as Eastwatch, but that was the first piece in the series that would carry her into a city that ate men with utensils they did not recognize. The man waiting by the cart had a face men would forget as soon as they turned away, which is a talent like any other. He took her small bundle, which contained a shirt and 2 knives, one of which had been made for meat, without comment. He said nothing when she climbed up, as if she had owned carts before this and had merely misplaced them for a year or two. She did not look at Ned. She stared into the dark that had begun to think about being light, and she did not blink as much as she should have. That was how she kept from crying, and he let her have that dignity because some dignity is not the good silver in the house which must be polished and displayed. It is the spoon a man eats from when he is alone. As the cart shook into its first ruts, she lifted a hand without turning her head. He raised his hand to answer it, and she would feel the answering in the air, though she did not look. The old rule held: if you do not mark the moment of loss too carefully, loss occasionally becomes less territorial. 2 days later, a raven came back against a wind that had intended to rebuke it and failed. It carried nothing but a bit of string in its beak. The string had a small knot at one end tied in the way Caitlin tied bandages when there were more men bleeding than there were hands to press. He did not know how Arya had contrived it, or whether the string had been placed there by a hand who understood the grammar of meaning better than some priests. He put it in his pocket and did not speak of it. The winter learned new tricks. It learned to move fog as if fog had come to school. It learned to push sound away from men and then slam it back so they shouted and then felt foolish when the quiet returned. It learned to lay the dead down in arrangements that made their discovery on patrol a message. Men stopped going out alone as if they had ever done so. The watch was a flock gathered tight and might have thinned itself into uselessness from fear if not for chores and the world's insistence that bread be made more or less daily and boots mended because feet do not care if their owners are frightened. Stannis did what he always did. He asked for that which was not being offered and then wore down those who could not refuse any longer because fatigue is as valid a force in the world as love. He mustered the men who would march and the banners that would follow, and he bristled at the levity that inevitably came when soldiers were about to do something most would not return from. Melisandre burned a man outside the wall because law meant nothing to her beyond the words that justified her desire, and because she had learned to position her fires where mercy could not put its hand on them. Ned watched from the yard's far shadow with Davos beside him and did not speak. He called the men's names inside until they settled to a heavy place and began to be less scalding. He talked to Stannis that night with no witnesses but the 3 old chairs and an iron brazier, and when they were done Stannis looked as a man looks who has had new weight put on his shoulders. That is not always a defeat. Sometimes men stand taller under such weight. He went. The route Ned suggested was a chain of towns that barely deserved the name and less glory. Stannis would do the work anyway and pretend he had been intending to all along. That is how wars are run by men who prize correctness more than flair. He took Deepwood Motte because it was a hinge that would swing the rest. He sent ahead to a family that had thought itself beyond regret. He moved down toward Winterfell with the grim certainty of a man walking on his own sense of the world. The world would often break its toe on such men before it yielded. Letters went and returned with tales of who wore furs that were not theirs and who said the right words with the wrong mouth. Roose Bolton moved like a shadow that had learned daylight. He wrote in a hand that had no ornament and only as much warmth as ink can exude when lit by a candle placed carefully to appear casual. Ned read each twice. He answered none. He had nothing to say to a man who believed cleverness and cold were the same. The sea threw one last story at them before the end of the winter's middle. A brother returned from a patrol with a tale no one could stand to smile at because a man's past had somehow laced its boot tight enough to climb into the present. "We saw a thing," he said, exhausted to where he sat without noticing the bench had ice on it, and when he lifted his head his eyes found Ned and did not leave. "A man on an elk if an elk were a noble. Birds with him, ravens in a cloud. He moved like no man I have ever seen on a horse, and he did not smell right." The man shuddered. "He did not smell wrong in the way things beyond the wall smell wrong now, my lord. He smelled like a winter a day past." He closed his eyes and swallowed. "Children with him," he said. "A big one that might have been where there used to be a man, and a boy with a face like a lord's drawn small." He looked around as if to ask which of them would think him lying. "He did not look at us," the brother finished in a mumble. "We were there, and then we were a story he had already heard." Ned felt something in his ribs that had been coals banked under ash for months find a breath of air. He did not say Benjamin's name. He did not allow it to take shape on his tongue. He did not say Brands. He folded the heat away because it would be needed for other work. He went to the weirwood in the grove with its steady tears and he asked nothing, because asking has a way of telling the gods what you want and the gods are shrewd. The last month before the equinox, men began to keep their weapons too clean. It is a symptom commanders learn to catch. They sharpen to an edge their fingers will bleed upon. They oil until wood would rather be anything else. It means the mind is doing work the arms cannot. Ned spoke to them and did not make it law. He told them stories instead. He told of how a man once walked from the Shadow Tower to Long Barrow because he was too proud to ask for a horse and found a mare in the midway that had escaped wolves, and how she took him the rest of the way because she had recognized in him a particular stupidity and loved him for it. He spoke of brothers who had made a song about how many ways porridge can be prepared and then learned to keep it to themselves because the winter punished joy as much as weakness. He spoke of men's hands and what they could shape other than blades. Little carved birds for a child who would never come north, a pipe that made a better music than the wind when held right. He did not say the word that men wanted him to say, soon. He did not lie. He woke in the night and listened. Sometimes the silence had a note at its bottom, as if something large were moving very far away. The last of Stannis's letters came on a raven with a blooded beak and feathers singed on one wingtip, which was not an omen but felt like one. The message was brief, because war had found him and would not allow their careful correspondence to continue to pretend itself sovereign. He had taken men in fur who called him king without meaning it and men without hats who called him beggar without meaning that either. He stated plainly that he would break the Boltons at Winterfell or the Boltons would break him there, and there was no persuasive essay appended to explain why the breaking would be in that place and not another because Stannis did not decorate inevitabilities. He did not ask for the North. He announced he would take the North's woe onto his ledger. He did not ask Ned for prayers. He would not have known what to do with them if they arrived. Ned walked the yard with the letter in his pocket and a coin in his other from a city that lived by telling men their names weren't necessary. He thought of the shape of his life had he bent his head once to a lie in a square built by southern hands. He put that shape against this and found that it did not fit into his ribs as this one did. He had his son, bruised into manhood by cold and necessity. He had a daughter on a road he could not see, learning to make no sound when she moved. He had another daughter south under gold whose edges cut. He had two sons neither lost nor found. He had this chair. He had the wall. He had men who would die if he failed to keep the mathematics exact. The attack on the Shadow Tower came on a night when the wind had gone slack as if it had withdrawn to watch. The first horn blew and the men in that tower knew in their bones before the third that this would be more than a raid to learn the shape of their discipline. Ned had men halfway there already because maps teach you where a blow must land. He sent more. He went himself insofar as the wall allowed. He stood on a platform between castles and felt the tremor come up through the old structure into his knees. The word men used later was waves. The dead came like waves. They had learned to carry ladders that did not splinter. They had learned to resist fire better by staying to darkness and moving in concert, which is a lesson even living men struggle to learn without shouting. The first ladder rose against the tower's side, and the man at the top looked up and saw a face turned to regard him that was so clean and beautiful it would have seemed holy if not for the eyes that had made a pact with something older than holiness. He forgot breath for a beat and then remembered. He set his teeth and drove the dragonglass into the ladder's rung, because sometimes you must strike the object rather than the idea. John's orders were dry wood, catching fast. Men ran where they were told. He sent one line to the left where a gap had appeared because a boy could not hold his bow when his fingers had gone past numb into some state that had nothing to do with human sensation anymore. He moved two from a place where they were making a point about how quickly they could kill into one where a point needed to be made slower and with an old steadiness. He shouted a name when a man looked down and saw his brother and lost 2 heartbeats to grief. He used Tormund like a cudgel and Davos like a spine, and the tower did not fall. Ned arrived as the last great push was sloughing away. He lifted a blade without drama and cut what was in front of him, because the only way to be a lord at such a time is to be a man, and men have always done this when asked by centuries. He slipped once on blood and saved himself by catching an iron spike that bit his palm deep enough to make him hiss. He felt oddly grateful. Blood keeps a man humble. Pride makes the hand tremble at the wrong time. A shape moved in front of him, fast as the frost's rim forming on water. He brought the dragonglass up, and the thing's sword slid across his. The sound a clean ringing like a goblet struck by a little silver spoon. He saw his face in it, distorted and old and honest as anything in this world gets to be. He set his feet and pressed and felt the give sudden, like an untrustworthy plank settling under weight. The other shivered into nothing, and the whites nearest it lagged, as if the mind had left the room and they were purely instruction now. "Burn the bodies," he said after, because it is the O-N-L-Y line in that catechism that matters. He watched until flame took, because men left to themselves without leadership after a battle will always find some way to self-harm. By relaxation too fast, by stories too greedy, by an unwise reach for ale. He let them tell 2 tales each and then sent them to their bunks or to piss or to lie down and find sleep standing up. He washed his hands in a basin with ice in it, because the cold is the only water there is, and because it keeps you awake enough to continue being gentle even when your body does not want to be. By morning, the world had lightened by a shade men only notice when they live every day under a slate sky. The dead had gone back into the trees to count themselves. The living poured oats into bowls and ate, because hunger does not care about stories. He wrote to Stannis and told him nothing that could be used by any man to draw a conclusion other than that the wall held, and that it would need more of what men called small things, wood and wool and women with the patience to make food palatable to men who had forgotten that food is one of the ways the living assert their right to keep walking. A ship arrived at Eastwatch 2 days before the equinox carrying salted cod, 2 copper plates, a man who could mend hinges without swearing, and a letter from Braavos. It was not in Arya's hand. That was as it should be. It contained a single coin folded into paper that smelled faintly of lemon, as if someone had tried to keep rats from it. The coin was iron, and on the face of it was a weirdly neutral man's face. On the back, a skull. Tucked with it, 2 words in a hand it was better not to name aloud: all men. Ned turned it over and over. He did not need the other half of the phrase to feel how the world had balanced itself briefly in that script. He put the coin away, and because he could not help it, he took it out again that night and put it on the table by the candle as if it might learn the room. Jon came without knocking, because a boy who becomes a man under his father's gaze earns that privilege by successive small merits. He stood at the door and looked for a moment as if his eyes could measure truth without needing it to tell him its height. "We held," he said, as if this were a new discovery and not something he had been repeating to himself since he could walk. "We did," Ned said. He watched Jon's shoulders. He watched the way his hands flexed once and then stilled, an old master teaching an old pupil a newer trick. "You will have to send men to the villages," he said, "to count who lived and to tell them what we need. They'll think you're robbing them, and you are, but it's the robbery that keeps them from having their whole world stolen." "I will," Jon said. He did not ask who he should send. He knew which men go well with people who have no use for men in black and which turn sour too quick. He had learned that basket by basket. "The South will break and knit and break again," Ned said. "We will not follow the breaking with our heads. We will keep our eyes on the crack of light along the ridge of the world. That is a piece of narrow mercy the wall grants. It tells men to look only where they can do something." "Rob," John began, and could not hang anything on the name. "Is doing what he must," Ned said. "We will do what we must. And then, if there is a later, we will make peace with the might-have-beens like men, not children." "Children are honest," John murmured. "Children are merciless," Ned said, and smiled because that is a mercy too. "They think everything will last forever. We will teach them what not to keep." They went up the wall together one more time before dawn. Men slept in the barracks with the stillness of those who have spent everything but leave the door cracked in case something asks for entry. The aurora was thin. The stars were firm and cold, and a few of them burned with a violence that felt almost rude. The world spread to the horizon and stopped, because men must be permitted to believe the line they see is the last. They stood without touching, and neither of them spoke, and it was as close to a prayer as either of them had said aloud in months. Somewhere beyond the trees a creature that had never learned to fear walls or men cried once, and the cry ended as if a hand had found its throat. The sound laid itself on Ned's heart for the pace of 3 breaths, and then slid off into the snow where it would freeze and get buried like everything else. He looked across the white and thought of a boy with a wolf's mouth, a girl with dirt under her nails she had placed there herself, a woman whose hair he had caught once in his fingers and felt the line of her skull under it, and thought he understood something about the world then that he does not now. He looked at the dragonglass in his belt and knew its precise weight. He looked north and did not blink until his eyes watered, so he could pretend he was only warding off the cold. When the day came up, it did not present a banner. It did not promise victory. It gave enough light to see men move. It gave enough cold to remind them they were alive. It was exactly the sort of day by which empires are saved and not thanked. He nodded once as if an old friend had just walked into the room, returned to the stairs, and went down to feed the fire that feeds the next one, and the next, and the one after that, until the line held not because of heroes but because of men who knew how to stack wood.